Hello everybody, Jeremy here. Well, I gotta say, last video I said I was gonna do Imagination next, as we are going through the Brian Wilson discography. But as I went on to Wikipedia, which is really where I do all my research because everything there is true and comprehensive, I saw that they had Orange Crate Art as the third Brian Wilson solo album. A bit strange to call this Brian Wilson solo album, as it really is primarily, to me, a Dyke Parks project with Brian Wilson involved. Obviously, he is very involved. His name is on the cover. It's a collaboration, is what it is. I don't really see this necessarily as a progression for, to track Brian's evolution through his solo career. This is a bit of a sidestep, two-step sidestep. Van Dyke's a genius too. But after talking to, a handful of people, I realized this is probably the time to talk about Orange Crate Art, even if this isn't necessarily like a Brian Wilson solo album. But we'll talk about it because this is, this came out before Imagination. I'm a little fuzzy on, whether this happened kind of in tandem with I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, that documentary, because there is footage in the doc of Brian singing Orange Crate Art with Van Dyke Parks playing the piano. Was that just at the very beginning of that process? I don't know, but this album came out afterwards, so let's talk about it. I'm probably not going to have as much to say about this album, not because there isn't much to say about it, but because I haven't listened to this album a ton. I've probably listened to it about, 6 or 7 times. I just listened to it yesterday and then again today to kind of gather some thoughts. But this video will be a little less thought out than some of my other videos. You're saying less? I didn't think it could get any less thought out. Well, ouch, first of all. But yeah, I just haven't listened to this album a bunch. I do like it. Orange Crate Art. This, what I'm holding right here, is the double LP version of the album. I don't think it ever came out at all as a single LP. I think it was just a CD, and then they released the dubs. Very nice package here. You've got a couple sleeves here that have the liner notes on them. You get a message from Van Dyke Parks, kind of a retrospective, as this set came out in 2020. And you also get something here from Brian Wilson talking about his experience working on the album. Both have very nice things to say about each other and the experience of making this album, which is very nice. I feel like there was a big handful of years there where Van Dyke was he's just kind of over the whole Brian Wilson thing. Understandably, he always seems to get sucked in, I'm sure in every interview, to talking about Smile, ad nauseum. And I'm sure that was a bit of a wrestling point for him over the years. He was so prolific. He worked with a lot of different artists that weren't Brian, worked on a lot of stuff that actually came out, officially. I get why he was annoyed about the topic of Smile, but it does seem like maybe in recent years he has made peace with the fact that that is a big chunk of his story. And he talked in a recent interview with Jenny Jambal. Great interview, by the way. That interview probably is going to be a lot more informative than this video, so if you want, you can go ahead and just exit out of this video, go over and watch. He talks a lot about this album in that interview, talks a lot about the individual songs. It's really quite illuminating. Van Dyke's lyrics can be a bit obtuse at times, and it's one of those rare circumstances where I actually think I would like to hear more from the artist about what the songs mean and who he's referencing. Usually I just kind of prefer, the music to speak for itself. And the music does, speak for itself here. Some great songs. Let's just talk about the songs for a little bit. I don't have, a ton to say about each track, but let's just go through real quick and we'll stop in a few spots. Orange Crate Art. Some people say it's a little overproduced in the vocal arrangement. I think it's great. You know, if you want a stripped down version of it, you can watch the Don Was doc, but beautiful vocal arrangement here by Van Dyke. And it is by Van Dyke. You know, over the years, people were saying that Brian was actually the one that arranged his vocals on this album, but Van Dyke has come forth a couple times to say, no, those were all my vocal arrangements. I dictated each part to Brian, and he sang it beautifully. So there you go. Brian really did just show up to sing what Van Dyke wanted him to. Some big improvements for Brian vocally, from where he was in the early 80s to Brian Wilson 1988, to his first solo album, to I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, to this album. This still isn't my favorite Brian Wilson voice for his solo career. He's doing a bit of a growl. I don't know how else to describe it. He growls a lot when he sings on this album. Some nice, beautiful moments, but a lot of growling. And I'm kind of happy with the voice that he finds in the next album, Imagination. He'll go on and use that voice, for the rest of his solo career. And I think he picked the right one. But yeah, anyways, Orange Crate Art's great. My favorite track on the album, to be honest. I tried learning it on the piano, actually. It's not quite as simple as you would think. I think Van Dyke said that he wrote this song for his daughter, who was learning piano. Complicated song here. There's some fancy chords. Track 2 is Sail Away, and I like Sail Away. It's a good song. Brian sings it really nicely. I love the melody. You do have to start talking about the production on the album and the way this whole album sounds. And I think for the most part, the songwriting and the arranging hold up. The choice of the instrumentation for the arrangements, that's where I think this album struggles the most. I don't love the way that the bass sounds across this whole album. I don't love how much synth is going on. Everything has that kind of dry 90s polished sound to it. I know Van Dyke was talking in that interview with Jenny about how this album really does kind of come together in this moment where analog and digital were converging. I do think this album would have benefited if it had been made, maybe 10 years later. You think about how Brian Wilson Presents Smile was put together. I think if that instrument palette had been used on this album, it would feel a lot more timeless, a little less cheesy in some parts. But again, the songwriting really shines despite some of those things. And for the most part, I think it doesn't really completely pull the songs down. My Hobo Heart is track 3, Wings of a Dove, track 4. I will say a lot of these songs go on, I do think, a little bit too long, but it's also, it's nice vibes. I love the whole California feeling on this album. I love Van Dyke's unique perspective on American history. He's so romantic about it, but he also sees it with clear eyes. Palm Tree and Moon, Summer in Monterey, that's an album that makes you feel like you're right on the beach. Palm Tree and Moon is a great song. It's got a lot of interesting twists and turns in it. Definitely one of my favorite songs on the album. San Francisco, this is a song that probably sounds maybe the most Smile-like with all the different vocal arrangements. It also is the one that I think suffers the most from the production, the sound of the production on the album. But I still enjoy listening to it. Hold Back Time, that's a sweet song. My Janine, I think we're hearing Tommy Morgan on this one with that bass harmonica. Quite a bit of harmonica on the album, but I think this is the only one where that bass harmonica comes in. Movies is Magic is another high point of the album. I do think when Van Dyke uses strings on this album, that's the moments where it sounds the most timeless and whimsical. This Town Goes at Sunset, this is the last song that has vocals on the album, and then there's the Lullaby. Again, there's this big string section. Kind of reminds me a lot of what he was doing on Song Cycle. And that completes the album proper. Of course, you get some extra bonus tracks. You get Rhapsody in Blue, which is lovely. I get why that wasn't included on Orange Crate Art. Rhapsody in Blue always makes me think of East Coast New York. So I don't think it would quite belong on here. Love is Here to Stay. Don't remember that one. What a Wonderful World. Lovely rendition of the song. Brian sings it beautifully. But again, I also kind of understand why that one isn't on the album. I love this album art. I like this beautiful painting of the ocean. I just actually watched the movie Grapes of Wrath with my wife, and because she had just read the book. I feel like especially this front painting kind of captures early rural Southern California in a beautiful way. Great stuff. I wish I had more insight to this album. I think the first time I listened to it, it wasn't really hitting for me, but it has really grown on me with each listen, and I think the whole thing is great. I'm glad that we have this type of collaboration between Van Dyke and Brian. You know, he was saying again in that interview that you really should go watch. It's over on Giggins' channel, by the way. He was saying how this album was kind of a thank you to Brian Wilson for helping him get into the industry, because this was kind of helping Brian get back into the recording industry, which I think is a sweet thing. Van Dyke talks about their shared backgrounds of, growing up in church and barbershop quartets. And even though this album isn't really like a Brian Wilson album to me, I think it's maybe one of the best collaborations he did with another artist, because Van Dyke seemed to know exactly what he wanted to do. And he seemed to exactly know what Brian's place was going to be on this album. And Brian seemed to take that on with a certain amount of professionalism and a sense of duty. It's a bit of a contrast to what we're going to see in solo albums from Brian in the future, where it's always a bit hazy how much was Brian and how much was his collaborator. With this album, it's very clear. We know exactly who was doing what, and you wonder if there was a sense of relief from Brian to know exactly what his role was and not have somebody or a group of people kind of expecting him to always be giving more or needing input that he didn't necessarily have. So yeah, this is great. The pressings sound fine. They're not amazing. They aren't going to blow you out of the water, but I think they're good enough. I think Omnivore did a great job with this one. So, thank you, Van Dyke Parks. Thank you, Brian Wilson. I would love to hear more from Van Dyke about this album. I feel like every time he talks about it, I understand it a little bit more and have more appreciation for it. So next week, we'll jump into Imagination and keep on trucking forward. Thanks for watching, and thanks for all of those who said I should include this album in the Brian Wilson discography marathon. I'm glad I did. If nothing else, it was nice to listen through the album again. So we'll see you next time.